Paul Bernardo. In the late 1980s, women across Scarborough, Ontario started reporting a pattern of attacks. Someone was following them after dark, assaulting them, and disappearing before police could get anywhere close. Investigators gave the unknown suspect a name: the Scarborough Rapist. For years, they worked the case with almost nothing to go on. What no one knew at the time was that the man behind those attacks had already found a willing partner, and together, they were about to commit crimes so severe that an entire country would demand its laws be rewritten. His name was Paul Bernardo. Born in 1964, he grew up in a middle-class Scarborough neighborhood that looked entirely ordinary from the outside. He was polite, well-groomed, socially confident. The kind of person neighbors would later struggle to reconcile with the man who had been terrorizing their streets for years. The Scarborough attacks had followed a pattern that left investigators chasing shadows. The assaults happened at night, often near bus stops, targeting women who were alone. Bernardo would later admit in court proceedings to assaulting at least 14 women during this period. Police had a DNA sample, they had a geographic profile, but they could not put a face to the attacks. And while investigators worked the case, Bernardo met a woman named Karla Homolka. They married in 1991. The media would eventually give them a name that stuck: the Ken and Barbie Killers. In December of 1990, Homolka's 15-year-old sister Tammy was harmed fatally during an assault in the family home. Bernardo was later convicted of manslaughter in her death. Then, in June of 1991, the couple abducted 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey from Burlington, Ontario. In April of 1992, they took 15-year-old Kristen French from St. Catharines. Both girls were subjected to prolonged and deliberate mistreatment before their lives were taken. The assaults were recorded on videotape, and those recordings would become the most damaging evidence at trial. Homolka struck a deal with prosecutors before the tapes were discovered. She received a 12-year sentence in exchange for her testimony. When the videotapes later surfaced and revealed the full extent of her participation, the public was outraged. The plea agreement became known across Canada as the Deal with the Devil. Bernardo's trial unfolded before Associate Chief Justice Patrick Lesage. On September 1, 1995, the jury deliberated for roughly 7 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 9 counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. He received a life sentence that same day. 2 months later, on November 3, 1995, he was formally declared a dangerous offender. Lesage told the court that Bernardo would require incarceration for the rest of his natural life, calling him a sexually sadistic psychopath whose likelihood of being treated was remote in the extreme. Lesage would later break down at a judicial seminar, saying he had never gotten over what he had seen during the trial and had considered stepping down before the dangerous offender hearing. For 18 years, Bernardo was held in segregation at Kingston Penitentiary, isolated largely for his own safety. When Kingston Pen closed in 2013, he was transferred to Millhaven Institution, Canada's maximum security federal prison in Bath, Ontario. That transfer barely made the news. The one that came a decade later would set the country on fire. In November of 2015, Bernardo self-published a 631-page thriller novel on Amazon, listing it at $7.77. The book briefly climbed the charts in a war fiction category before Amazon pulled it. Correctional officials stated that inmates cannot profit from recounting their crimes, though they characterized the book as fiction unrelated to his offenses. He was denied both day parole and full parole in October of 2018, and denied again in June of 2021. At the 2018 hearing, the parole board stated plainly that he presented an undue risk to society, noting he had been diagnosed as a sexual deviant who met the criteria for psychopathy, and that he used what they called a self-diagnosis as a mantra to distance himself from what he had done. At the 2021 hearing, board member Maureen Gauci told him his understanding and insight remained limited, and that he continued to pose a high risk for sexual reoffending. Bernardo himself told the board in 2018 that he was deeply flawed, that what he had done was dreadful, that he cried all the time. By 2021, he had changed his tone entirely, claiming without qualification that he was low risk and complaining of 10,000 days without meaningful human contact. The board was not persuaded either time. Then, on May 29, 2023, Bernardo was quietly moved from Millhaven to La Macasa, a medium security facility in Quebec. The families of his victims received no meaningful advance notice. The backlash was immediate and national. Correctional Service Commissioner Ann Kelly acknowledged publicly that Bernardo had committed horrific and unspeakable crimes, whose impact on the victims and their families was immeasurable. A review committee later found that the transfer had followed all applicable laws and policies. But by then, the damage to public trust was done. Donna French, Kristen's mother, had told an earlier hearing that time does not heal the pain, and that the pain itself is a life sentence. For the families, every hearing and every transfer forces them to relive what they have spent decades trying to survive. Bernardo remains incarcerated on an indeterminate dangerous offender sentence. The transfer did not shorten it. He is now in his early 60s, and somehow he is not even the most reviled man to have passed through Canada's federal prison system. That distinction, for an older generation of Canadians, belongs to someone else entirely. Clifford Olson. In the summer of 1981, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police agreed to a deal that would haunt the country for decades. They paid a confessed killer $100,000, deposited into a trust fund for his wife and infant son, in exchange for one thing. He would lead them to the remains of 11 children. The payment worked out to roughly $10,000 per body. The man on the other end of that agreement provided one set of remains before the deal was even signed. He called it a freebie. His name was Clifford Olson. Born on New Year's Day, 1940, in Vancouver, Olson had been cycling through the criminal justice system since his teenage years. Fraud, robbery, sexual offenses. He was a career criminal the system had processed dozens of times before. Nothing in his lengthy record hinted at what was coming. Between November of 1980 and July of 1981, Olson killed 11 children and young people across British Columbia's Lower Mainland. Christine Weller, 12. Colleen Daigneault, 13. Darren Johnsrud, 16. Sandra Wolfsteiner, 16. Ada Court, 13. Simon Partington, 9 years old. Judy Kozma, 14. Raymond King Jr., 15. Sigrun Arnd, an 18-year-old German tourist. Terry Lynn Carson, 15. Louise Chartrand, 17. They were children walking to school, teenagers looking for summer work, young people who trusted a stranger who seemed to know exactly what to say. The scope of what Olson did to them was described in court filings as staggering in cruelty, a pattern of predatory, deliberate harm that had gone undetected for the better part of a year across multiple jurisdictions. He was arrested on August 12, 1981, near Port Alberni, after an undercover surveillance operation that had been running for weeks. And then came the deal. The RCMP, with approval from British Columbia's Attorney General and Federal Solicitor General Robert Kaplan, authorized the $100,000 trust payment to Olson's wife, Joan. The justification was simple and grim. Without Olson's cooperation, investigators believed they would never find the children. The families of the victims sued in 1984 to have the trust voided. The British Columbia Court of Appeal ruled against them in March of 1986, finding that the payment had been made to obtain evidence leading to a conviction, not as compensation for the killer. On January 14, 1982, Olson pleaded guilty to 11 counts of first-degree murder. He received 11 concurrent life sentences. Justice McKay addressed him directly from the bench, saying he did not have the words to adequately describe the enormity of the crimes, and that no punishment a civilized country could impose would be adequate. 11 life sentences, all served at the same time. That's not a typo, by the way. For the next 30 years, Olson made himself into what many described as the most despised and most litigious inmate in Canadian history. He filed dozens of frivolous legal challenges against the courts, the prison system, and individual corrections staff. He wrote taunting letters directly to the parents of his victims. He gave interviews in which he showed no remorse and seemed to enjoy the attention his notoriety brought him. Every procedural mechanism the system offered, he weaponized. Every right afforded to him as an inmate, he used as a tool for provocation and harassment. In August of 1997, after serving 15 years, Olson applied for early parole eligibility under the Faint Hope Clause. The jury needed just 15 minutes to reject him. The speed of that decision spoke for itself. The public outrage that followed helped push Parliament toward barring multiple murderers from using the clause. It was fully repealed in 2011. At his mandatory review in 2006, Olson told the board he would not be returning to hear their decision, which he called retarded, and then launched into a series of bizarre claims, including that the United States had granted him some form of clemency in connection with information he supposedly possessed about the September 11th attacks. He was denied again that year, and again in 2010. Around 2010, it also emerged that Olson had been collecting federal pension and old age security payments, totaling roughly $1,169 per month while behind bars. A man serving 11 life sentences for killing 11 children was receiving a government check every month. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Not until a journalist broke the story and the public demanded an explanation. The revelation eventually prompted a change in the law to cut off such payments to incarcerated prisoners. Olson died of cancer on September 30th, 2011, at 71 years old, in a Quebec facility. He never spent a single day as a free man after his arrest. Raymond King, the father of 15-year-old Raymond King Jr., spoke publicly after learning of the death. He said Olson would never be able to open those wounds again. It was done. It was over. And now, after 3 decades, it was finally time for him to begin healing. Olson's case reshaped Canadian criminal justice in ways that are still felt today. The victims' rights movement found its footing in his wake. The Missing Children's Registry was established partly because of the failures his case exposed, and the Faint Hope Clause was abolished. He was the last multiple murderer in Canada allowed to use it. Olson proved what a career criminal could become when the system failed to intervene in time. But the next man on this list was something far harder to explain. He was not a criminal at all. He was a decorated officer in the Canadian military. Russell Williams. On February 7, 2010, a decorated colonel in the Royal Canadian Air Force sat down in a small interrogation room across from OPP Detective Sergeant Jim Smith. This was a man who had flown prime ministers and foreign dignitaries on government aircraft, a man who just 7 months earlier had been entrusted with command of CFB Trenton, the largest and busiest airbase in the entire country. And when the detective asked him directly, where the body of a missing 27-year-old woman was, the colonel did not deny anything. He asked for a map. If you had asked anyone at CFB Trenton about Colonel David Russell Williams in the summer of 2009, they would have described a model officer. Born in Bromsgrove, England in 1963, Williams emigrated to Canada as a child and built a military career that checked every box. He was disciplined, ambitious, and trusted with sensitive operations. His appointment to command CFB Trenton was the kind of posting that signaled a career still climbing. Nobody around him had any idea. What investigators would later piece together was that Williams had been living a second life for years. Police documented at least 82 break-ins in the Tweed, Ontario area and in Ottawa, where he owned properties, all targeting women's homes. He stole underwear and intimate items, then photographed himself wearing what he had taken, keeping meticulous records of every intrusion. The break-ins escalated into 2 violent sexual assaults in the Tweed area, and then they escalated further. In November of 2009, Corporal Marie-France Comeau, 38 years old, a military flight attendant who served under Williams's command at Trenton, was found dead in her Brighton, Ontario home. She had been bound, sexually assaulted, and suffocated. Investigators initially had no suspect. Then, in late January of 2010, 27-year-old Jessica Lloyd vanished from her home near Belleville. Her family reported her missing after she failed to show up for work. Police found signs of a struggle inside the house, but no body and no clear lead. The break came from a tire tread. A police checkpoint set up on Highway 37 flagged Williams' Nissan Pathfinder as matching tracks found near Lloyd's property. His boots also matched prints recovered at the scene. Smythe brought Williams in and sat across from him for roughly 10 hours. It has since become one of the most widely studied interrogations in Canadian law enforcement. Williams opened the session by asking Smith to call him Russ. For hours, the two sat across from each other while Smith laid out the forensic evidence piece by piece, calmly and methodically, narrowing the colonel's options with every question. Williams initially tried to steer the conversation, but Smith never raised his voice, never lost patience, and never gave him room to construct a plausible denial. The turning point came when Smith asked point blank where Jessica Lloyd was. Williams paused. Then he gave a response that investigators would later describe as the 4 words that buried him. "You got a map." He led police to Lloyd's body that same night. When officers searched his Ottawa home, they recovered nearly 3,000 images and video files documenting his crimes, hidden but meticulously organized. Williams pleaded guilty. On October 21, 2010, he received 2 concurrent life sentences for first-degree murder, with 25 years of parole ineligibility. He also received 2 10-year sentences for the sexual assaults, 2 10-year sentences for forcible confinement, and 82 concurrent 1-year sentences for the break-ins. As a multiple first-degree murderer, he was ineligible for the faint hope clause. The military's response came the following day and was, by all accounts, unprecedented in Canadian Forces history. The Governor-General stripped Williams of his rank, his commission, and every military decoration he had received, on the recommendation of the Chief of the Defense Staff. At CFB Trenton, his uniform was burned, his medals were cut into pieces, his commission scroll was shredded. The Nissan Pathfinder used in the crimes was crushed and scrapped at a military facility. War Museum Director Jack Granatstein called the entire process an exorcism, saying the forces were purging the memory of Russell Williams from their ranks. Despite all of this, Williams retained a military pension of roughly $60,000 per year. Eliminating it would have required an act of Parliament. He also refused to pay $8,000 in court-ordered victim surcharges. Williams was initially held in segregation at Kingston Penitentiary before being transferred to Port Cartier, a maximum security federal prison in Quebec. His wife divorced him. Civil lawsuits brought by the victims' families and survivors were settled between 2014 and 2015. He remains at Port Cartier today, serving 2 concurrent life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years. And no, I'm not making that up. A man who flew the Prime Minister one year was convicted of double murder the next. A man who commanded thousands of military personnel and oversaw sensitive operations spent his evenings cataloging break-ins in a personal archive that ran into the thousands of files. Williams' case forced Canadians to confront something deeply uncomfortable. The most dangerous predators do not always come from the margins of society. Sometimes they sit at the very center of it, wearing a uniform, holding a rank, shaking hands with dignitaries. But the next man on this list took a different kind of camouflage. He didn't hide behind a uniform. He hid behind a family fortune. Dellen Millard. Dellen Millard came from wealth. His grandfather Carl had founded Millardair, one of Canada's most established private aviation companies, and the family had built a fortune around it. Millard grew up with access to aircraft, property, and the kind of money that opens every door. He also purchased a large livestock incinerator, the kind farmers use to dispose of animal remains. He and a friend gave it a nickname, the Eliminator. But the Eliminator was not built for livestock. By the time investigators understood what it was actually being used for, 3 people were dead, and one of them was Millard's own father. The first victim was Laura Babcock. 23 years old, she had been involved with Millard in what investigators later described as a love triangle. In July of 2012, Babcock disappeared without a trace. Her body was never recovered. Prosecutors would eventually argue that Millard killed her and incinerated her remains, leaving her family with nothing to bury and no way to say goodbye. 5 months later, on November 29, 2012, Millard's father Wayne was found dead in his home with a gunshot wound through his left eye. The death was initially ruled a suicide. That ruling would stand for years before police came back to it with a very different conclusion. Then came Tim Bosma. On May 6, 2013, Bosma, a 32-year-old husband and father from Ancaster, Ontario, posted an ad online to sell his Dodge Ram pickup truck. He was a tradesman, well-liked, with a young daughter and a wife named Charlene. Millard and his friend Mark Smich responded to the listing and arranged a test drive. Bosma climbed into the cab with the 2 men that evening and was never seen alive again. His disappearance sparked a massive search across the Hamilton area. Charlene Bosma went public with appeals for information, and the case drew national attention within days. When police tracked Millard down, they found Bosma's charred remains inside the Eliminator on a rural property Millard controlled near Waterloo. The incinerator had been purchased under an alias, and it already held forensic evidence of at least 1 prior killing. Millard and Smike were convicted of first-degree murder in the Bosma case on June 17, 2016, receiving the automatic life sentence with 25 years before parole eligibility. They were convicted again in the Babcock case in December of 2017. Then, on September 24, 2018, Justice Maureen Forrestel convicted Millard of first-degree murder in the death of his own father in a judge-alone trial. Millard had represented himself. Forrestel stated in her ruling that she was satisfied Dellen Millard killed his father by shooting him in the left eye, citing cell phone location evidence and his purchase of the murder weapon. He was originally sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms, which meant 75 years before parole eligibility. At the time, It was the longest parole ineligibility period ever handed down in Canadian history. Then the Supreme Court's 2022 decision in R. vs. Bissonnette struck down the practice of stacking consecutive parole ineligibility periods entirely, ruling it unconstitutional. Millard's effective maximum dropped to 25 years, 3 separate murders, 3 separate trials, 3 first-degree murder convictions. And the parole timeline became identical to what a single conviction would have carried. The Bosma and Babcock families had sat through years of proceedings only to watch the sentencing framework they had counted on be dismantled by a ruling in an unrelated case. And somehow, it gets worse. On July 11, 2021, while serving his sentence at Millhaven Institution, Millard participated in the stabbing of a fellow inmate named Sean Trites. Surveillance footage from inside the prison showed Millard physically restraining Trites, while a second prisoner, Clayton Sumner, carried out the actual stabbing. Millard was convicted on March 6, 2023, of assault causing bodily harm and sentenced to 1 additional year, to be served concurrently with his existing sentences. The Crown described him at sentencing as the worst offender that could come before any court. Millard, who once again chose to represent himself, submitted what the presiding judge characterized as an imaginative version of the events captured on camera. All 3 of his murder appeals were rejected by mid-2023. He was later transferred from Millhaven to Beaver Creek, a medium security facility, a move that Charlene Bosma, Tim's widow, publicly called disgusting. Charlene Bosma had spoken at Millard's original sentencing years earlier. She told the court that the verdict did not bring Tim back. For his killers, she said, their life sentence was just beginning. But for her family, their life sentence had started more than 3 years ago. The night Tim left for a test drive and never came home, Justice Michael Code, who presided over the Babcock trial, addressed Millard and Smish before they were led out of the courtroom. He wished them good luck in the penitentiary and said he meant it sincerely. Laura Babcock's family also spoke. They looked at the 2 men who had taken their daughter and told them plainly that they had made them hate. Millard remains incarcerated. His co-accused Mark Smike was transferred to medium security Beaver Creek before Millard followed him there, a proximity that the Bosma family found deeply troubling. Millard will be eligible to apply for parole in the 2040s. Whether any board will ever grant it is another matter entirely. If you're enjoying this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next video. David Bagshaw. On New Year's Day, 2008, a 14-year-old girl named Stephanie Rengel was lured from her East York home by a boy she barely knew. Within minutes, her life was taken on the street where she lived. The boy who did it was 17 years old, just days short of his 18th birthday. But he was not the one who had wanted Stephanie dead. That was his girlfriend, a 15-year-old named Melissa Todorovich, who had spent the better part of 8 months orchestrating the killing through thousands of electronic messages, and who phoned approximately 15 minutes afterward to confirm that it was done. Nobody around Stephanie Rengel saw this coming. She was a 14-year-old living in a quiet Toronto neighborhood, finishing middle school, surrounded by family. She had no way of knowing that a girl she had never met had marked her for death over something that barely qualified as a reason. David Bagshaw had briefly and platonically dated Rengel roughly 2 years before the killing. That connection, insignificant by any reasonable measure, had become a fixation for his girlfriend Todorovich. Despite having never met Rengel or spoken to her, Todorovich developed what investigators and prosecutors would later describe as a pathological obsession. Over an 8-month period, she sent Bagshaw tens of thousands of messages through MSN Messenger, escalating from jealous complaints to explicit, sustained demands that he kill Stephanie Rengel. She used sexual blackmail, emotional manipulation, and repeated threats to cut off all contact unless he went through with it. In one message recovered by police, she told him flatly that she would block him until the killing was done. Todorovic did not waver. She did not let up. She built a campaign of pressure so relentless that the Crown would later characterize her as the plot's true architect. On the evening of January 1, 2008, Bagshaw contacted Stephanie and lured her outside. She came willingly, with no understanding of what was about to happen. What followed was described in court filings as a deliberate and premeditated attack. Stephanie Rengel's life was taken that night on a residential street in East York. She was 14 years old. When emergency responders arrived, it was too late. The investigation moved quickly. Police identified Bagshaw through witness accounts and digital evidence, and the tens of thousands of messages between him and Todorovic laid bare the full scope of the conspiracy. The sheer volume of the digital record made the prosecution's case difficult to contest. Both Bagshaw and Todorovic were charged with first-degree murder and tried as adults. Bagshaw was convicted and sentenced to life with parole ineligibility set at 10 years. Todorovic was convicted in 2009 and received life with ineligibility set at 7 years, reflecting her role as the plot's driving force despite not being physically present at the scene. Her appeal, which argued that her police statements should have been excluded under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, failed. The case drew significant attention for the way it exposed how digital communication could be used as a tool of coercion and manipulation between teenagers, raising questions that the courts had not fully dealt with before. Bagshaw entered the federal prison system and was eventually housed at Millhaven Institution. His conduct inside did not suggest someone moving toward rehabilitation. In 2013, while at Millhaven, he was convicted of assault with a weapon and assault causing bodily harm against a fellow inmate, receiving a sentence of 2 years and 6 months to be served concurrently with his life term. Corrections officials also documented what they described as an inappropriate relationship with a staff member, a breach of institutional rules that raised further concerns about his judgment. He was later found to have falsely claimed on a legal document that he was the father of his fiancée's children, an act the parole board would later flag as evidence of ongoing dishonesty. In 2021, Bagshaw appeared before the Parole Board of Canada for a 3-hour virtual hearing while being held at Bath Institution, a medium-security facility near Kingston. He was denied both day parole and full parole. Board member Savannah Gentile told him he still had significant progress to make before release could be considered. Bagshaw told the board he was disgusted with himself for what he had done, that he hated himself for it, and that he thought about it every day. Stephanie Rengel's mother, Patricia Hung, delivered a victim impact statement at the hearing. She told the board that even now, more than a decade later, she worries in secret whenever her 18-year-old son rides his bicycle to the park. That fear, she said, never leaves. Todorovic's own parole path has been turbulent. She was granted day parole in 2018, but it was revoked after she became involved in a secret relationship the board characterized as a love triangle. She received unescorted temporary absences in 2024 and was granted day parole again in 2025. The families of Stephanie Rengel continue to carry the weight of a crime that was orchestrated through a screen by a teenager who never once met the girl she wanted dead. Bagshaw remains in federal custody, but if his case illustrated how obsession and digital manipulation could turn a teenager into a killer, the next name on this list proved that wealth, age, and outward respectability could hide something far colder and far more calculated. Helmuth Buxbaum, Helmuth Buxbaum arrived in Canada in the late 1950s as a penniless 19-year-old German immigrant with an Austrian boarding school education and not much else. Over the next 2 decades, he and his wife Hannah built a chain of Ontario nursing homes into a multi-million-dollar fortune. They were active in their Baptist church. They were generous donors. To everyone who knew them, the Buxbaums were a Canadian success story, the kind of couple who had earned everything they had through hard work and partnership. At least, that's what everyone believed. On a summer evening in 1984, on a highway outside London, Ontario, Hannah Buxbaum was dragged from the family car and shot 3 times in the head by a hired gunman. Her husband had arranged the entire thing. The marriage between Helmuth and Hannah had produced both a business empire and, behind closed doors, a spiral. Helmuth suffered a stroke in 1982, and in the years that followed, his behavior deteriorated sharply. He developed a serious cocaine addiction. He began spending large amounts of time and money with prostitutes. Funds were disappearing from the couple's accounts at an alarming rate, roughly $2 million by one estimate. Those closest to the Buxbaums noticed changes, but nobody intervened. And at some point during this period, Helmuth Buxbaum made a decision. He arranged to have his wife killed and to collect a life insurance payout he had recently structured for exactly that purpose. He took out a $1 million life insurance policy on Hannah shortly before the murder. That detail alone would later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence against him. On July 5, 1984, Helmuth, Hannah, and their 14-year-old nephew were driving on a highway near Komoka, just outside London, Ontario, when they stopped to assist what appeared to be a stranded vehicle on the roadside. It was a setup. A hired gunman named Gary Fauché approached the car, dragged Hannah out, and shot her 3 times in the head. The teenager in the back seat witnessed the entire thing. Trial testimony reported by the Globe and Mail described Hannah's final moments. As she was being pulled from the vehicle, she spoke directly to her husband, pleading with him not to do this, not this way. Those were, by all accounts, the last words she ever spoke. The investigation took time, but the pieces came together. Fauché was identified as the triggerman. A man named Robert Barrett was linked to the conspiracy as the intermediary who had arranged for the killers. Financial records revealed the missing millions and the suspiciously timed insurance policy. And at the center of it all sat Helmuth Buxbaum, the grieving husband who had orchestrated the killing of his own wife and business partner for money he had already squandered on drugs and prostitutes. The trial lasted 68 days and became one of the most sensational proceedings in Ontario's legal history. The courtroom heard testimony from prostitutes, drug dealers, underworld contacts, and former associates who described a man living a double life that bore almost no resemblance to the respectable church-going philanthropist the community thought they knew. Witnesses detailed the cocaine binges, the relationships with sex workers, the vanishing funds. The prosecution methodically connected Buxbaum to every stage of the conspiracy, from the insurance policy to the hiring of Fauché to the staged roadside breakdown. The jury heard it all, every lurid detail, over the course of more than 2 months. They deliberated for 12.5 hours before convicting Buxbaum, then 46 years old, of first-degree murder. On February 13, 1986, he was sentenced to life with no parole for 25 years. Fauché was convicted of second-degree murder. Barrett was convicted of conspiracy. The nursing home empire Helmuth and Hannah had built together did not survive the scandal. Buxbaum spent his remaining years in federal custody, moving through facilities including Warkworth Institution and the Kingston Penitentiary Regional Hospital. He filed no notable appeals. He gave no public statements. He made no effort to explain or justify what he had done. For 2 decades, he simply existed inside the system he had been sentenced to. A man who had once employed hundreds of people and hosted Sunday dinners after church, now reduced to an inmate number in a medium security ward. He died in custody on November 1st, 2007, at the age of 68. Toronto Star reporter Heather Bird, who had covered the 68-day trial from start to finish, later published a book on the case titled Conspiracy to Murder: The Helmuth Buxbaum Trial. It remains one of the few detailed accounts of a case that Ontario largely chose to forget. What made the Buxbaum case linger in the public memory was not the violence itself, but the calculation behind it. A man who had spent decades building a life alongside his wife, raising a family, growing a business, standing in church pews on Sunday mornings, had quietly arranged to have her executed on a highway shoulder by a gunman she had never met. He then went through the motions of grief while waiting for the insurance check. It was a betrayal so complete that it forced everyone who had known the Buxbaums to reconsider what they had actually been looking at for all those years. But not every inmate at Millhaven was defined by a single act of violence. Some were defined by a lifetime of them. And nobody embodied that pattern more completely than a man from Cornwall, Ontario, who somehow turned decades of crime into one of the most celebrated books in Canadian history. Roger Mad Dog Caron. In 1978, an inmate with barely a grade school education won Canada's most prestigious literary award. His memoir, written in a prison cell by a man who had first learned to spell by arranging jelly beans into words on his cell floor, sold more than 600,000 copies. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau called him a great Canadian. His name was Roger Caron, and the guards and the tabloid press knew him by another name entirely: Mad Dog. He had broken out of 13 prisons, robbed more banks than anyone could tally, and spent the better part of 4 decades locked up. And somehow, he turned all of it into a Governor General's award. Caron was born on April 12, 1938, in Cornwall, Ontario, to parents who had almost nothing. He was first incarcerated at 17 and spent the bulk of his adult life behind bars, cycling through Kingston Penitentiary, Millhaven Institution, and more than a dozen other facilities across the country. He earned the nickname Mad Dog from Quebec media in the 1960s, after a string of armed robberies and increasingly brazen escape attempts that left corrections officials baffled. 13 successful escapes in total, more than any other criminal in Canadian history. He went over walls, through fences, out of transport vehicles, and through doors that were supposed to be locked. The man simply would not stay put. But Caron had a second life inside those walls. Despite his near illiteracy, he began teaching himself to write. The process was painstaking and, at times, almost absurd in its difficulty. He described his earliest efforts as physically arranging jelly beans into letter shapes on the floor of his cell just to learn the words. Over years of solitary confinement and long stretches in segregation, he developed enough skill to produce a full-length manuscript. That manuscript became Go Boy, Memories of a Life Behind Bars, published in 1978. It won the Governor General's Award for Nonfiction that same year and went on to sell more than 600,000 copies. Journalist Catherine Fogarty described the book as the account of a man who had been whipped, stabbed, clubbed, tear-gassed, and subjected to years of solitary confinement. It was raw, unflinching, and unlike anything Canadian readers had encountered from the inside of a prison. Go Boy made Caron famous overnight. He was paroled, hired by Corrections Canada to deliver motivational talks across the country, and held up as the poster boy for prison rehabilitation. He wrote 3 more books, including Bingo, an eyewitness account of the 1971 Kingston Penitentiary riot that remains one of the only first-person records of that event, a novel called Jojo, and a third titled Dreamcaper. For a stretch of years, the transformation appeared genuine. A career criminal had found a voice. A man who had spent his entire life destroying things had created something that people valued. Corrections officials pointed to him as proof that the system, when it worked, could produce real change. It did not last. On April 1, 1992, Karen robbed an Ottawa Zellers department store. He was high on cocaine and visibly shaking from the Parkinson's disease that had been diagnosed in the early 1980s. Police caught him minutes later on a city bus, still carrying the proceeds. The great Canadian, the reformed prisoner, the Governor General's award-winning author, arrested for holding up a department store while trembling so badly he could barely stand. He was convicted in 1993 of 7 charges and also pleaded guilty to hostage-taking and assault at the Brockville Psychiatric Hospital, where he had been held before trial. While awaiting those proceedings, he attempted to escape custody at least 3 times. Even in his 50s, even with his health failing, the instinct to run had never left him. The relapses continued into the next decade. In 2001, Karen was arrested at the Rideau Center in Ottawa carrying a gym bag that contained a loaded .32 caliber pistol, a wig, a knife, surgical gloves, and duct tape. The contents of that bag told a story that needed no explanation. He was sentenced in 2004 to 20 months for illegal gun possession. In March of 2005, he was acquitted of a separate string of robberies that were also tied to 2001. But the damage to whatever remained of his public reputation was total. By then, Parkinson's disease and advancing dementia had taken firm hold. The man who had once scaled prison walls and outrun guards across half of Canada could no longer dress himself. Roger Karen died on April 11, 2012, one day before his 74th birthday at Sandfield Place, a nursing home in his hometown of Cornwall, Ontario. His Ottawa Citizen obituary ran under a headline that quoted Trudeau's old assessment, "A great Canadian." The tragedy of Karen's story is not that he failed. Plenty of people fail. The tragedy is that he proved, publicly and undeniably, that the system could work, and then proved just as publicly that it could fall apart. Go Boy was not a fluke. It was a genuine piece of Canadian literature, one that opened a national conversation about prison conditions and rehabilitation that had never been had in that way before. And then its author went back to robbing department stores with shaking hands and a loaded pistol in a gym bag. Rehabilitation gave him a second chance. Addiction and the life he had known since he was 17 took it back. But the final name on this list wrestled with that exact same tension for his entire adult life, and he did it on a scale that stretched across 2 countries, more than 100 banks, and an FBI most wanted list. Stephen Reed. In the 1970s, 3 men with a stopwatch robbed their way through more than 100 banks across North America. By most estimates, they stole roughly $15 million over the course of a decade. They were so precise that the average heist lasted 90 seconds or less. They were so disciplined that law enforcement on both sides of the border spent years trying to figure out who they were. Their most famous job was a 1974 theft of approximately $750,000 in gold bullion from the Ottawa International Airport, a haul so clean that investigators were left with almost nothing to work with. The FBI gave them a name: the Stopwatch Gang. The leader of that crew was Stephen Reed. Born on March 13, 1950, in Massey, Ontario, Reed came from Irish and Ojibwa descent and had a childhood that ended early. He hitchhiked to Vancouver at 13 and fell into heroin and cocaine addiction almost immediately. The drugs fueled the crime funded the drugs, and for the next 2 decades, Reed and his partners, Patty Mitchell and Lionel Wright, built one of the most sophisticated robbery operations in North American history. The gang's name came from the stopwatch Reed wore around his neck during heists, timing each job to keep it under 90 seconds. They were fast, methodical, and careful. Sources vary on the exact count, but the stopwatch gang is believed to have hit somewhere between 100 and 140 banks, armored cars, and other targets across Canada and the United States throughout the 1970s and 80s. They rarely used violence and almost never left physical evidence behind. Reed was arrested in an FBI raid in Arizona in 1980, wanted at the time for 31 robberies across the western United States. He was returned to Canada and sentenced to 21 years at Kent Institution, a maximum security federal prison in Agassiz, British Columbia. It was inside Kent that Reed's life took an unexpected turn. He began writing, and he had a genuine talent for it. He submitted a manuscript to Susan Musgrave, a respected Canadian poet, who was then serving as writer-in-residence at the University of Waterloo. What started as a professional correspondence grew into something deeper. On October 12, 1986, Reed and Musgrave were married inside Kent Institution. That same year, he published Jackrabbit Parole, a semi-autobiographical novel about bank robbery and prison life that drew critical praise for its authenticity and its prose. Reed was paroled in 1987. He moved to Vancouver Island with Musgrave and their daughters, taught creative writing at Camosun College, and worked as a youth counselor in the Northwest Territories. For more than a decade, the former leader of the Stopwatch gang lived quietly and lawfully. He was clean, employed, married to one of Canada's most respected poets, and raising a family. By any measure, it was the outcome the parole system was designed to produce. Then, on June 9, 1999, Reed walked into a Victoria, British Columbia bank dressed in a police uniform. He and an accomplice robbed the branch of roughly $92,000 to $97,000. The robbery went wrong almost immediately. When police responded, Reed fired a .44 Magnum revolver at a pursuing motorcycle officer and discharged another round near a civilian bystander during the ensuing chase. The standoff that followed ended with Reed's arrest. He was sentenced to 18 years for armed robbery and attempted murder. 12 years of sobriety and a stable life had collapsed in under an hour. In prison, Reed kept writing. He channeled the years into prose, and the work was strong. His essay collection, A Crowbar in the Buddhist Garden, examined addiction, incarceration, and the cycles that had defined his life. It won the 2013 City of Victoria Butler Book Prize. Even locked up for the second time, even after everything he had thrown away, the writing still carried weight. Critics noted that Reed's voice on the page was honest in a way that most prison memoirs are not. He did not make excuses. He did not romanticize what he had done. He simply described the two forces that had pulled at him since childhood, the addiction and the compulsion, and let the reader sit with the contradiction. Reed was granted release in phases between 2014 and 2015. At his 2015 parole hearing, he described himself as a clean and sober grandfather. He moved to Haida Gwaii, the remote island archipelago off the northern coast of British Columbia, and lived there with Musgrave in relative quiet. For the last few years of his life, the former bank robber lived among old-growth forests and shoreline, far from the cities he had spent decades robbing. Stephen Reed died on June 12, 2018, at the age of 68. The cause was pulmonary edema and third-degree heart block. Musgrave, his wife of 31 years, released a statement noting that 7 killer whales had appeared in the local inlet the day Reed was hospitalized. In Haida tradition, that is understood as a sign of impending death. Reed's story does not resolve neatly. He was a thief, an addict, a man who fired a loaded weapon at a police officer on a public street. He was also a husband of 31 years, a father, a published author whose work won literary awards, and a teacher who spent time counseling young people in remote communities. The tension between those two lives never went away. It defined him from the moment he left Massey, Ontario, as a 13-year-old with a thumb out on the highway, all the way to the shoreline of Haida Gwaii, where the killer whales came in close. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.